All right, we just a couple minutes late getting started here, but we are going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for coming to the Public Safety and Homeland Security Committee meeting, and I am going to ask Chairman Victor Anderson if he would open us up in a word of prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us pray. Dear kind and heavenly God, Father, God, we thank you, Lord, for the blessings of this earth, God, that you allow us to live in the area of this world that we live in, God. We ask your continued blessings on this state. We ask your guidance, your wisdom, and your discernment in this body as we set forth to guide and lead the citizens of Georgia. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right, we got 4 items on the agenda today, and looks like we're going to take those in order, the way they're on the agenda. First bill we're going to hear is going to be House Bill 205, Representative David Clark. And guest. So, all right, Representative, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and colleagues. I have with myself, with me is Tom Rawlings, and he'll be helping to answer questions that I cannot answer. I'll bring before you House Bill 205. It's a substitute, LC 394610S. And we just changed in the original, if you had read the bill, it had the Board of Homeland Security, and we just scratched that and put the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency, because they would actually be the ones handling this. So that was just clarifying that. Besides that, no other changes. I'm bringing this bill, House Bill 205, before you, kind of give you some context. The United States government, the U.S. Department of Defense, and numerous state governments and other authoritative sources have recognized that the vast majority of drones used in the United States are designed, manufactured, and or assembled specifically in the People's Republic of China. U.S. defense officials have made it clear the threat of Chinese-made drones to U.S. security. Unfortunately, these drones are popular, cheap, and effective. 2 Chinese companies, the DJI and the Autel, control 90% of the global drone market. Both companies have close connections to China's ruling Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army. And the drones have been deemed a significant security risk to the United States by both the FBI and the Federal Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the CISA. The threat comes from the facts that, 1, these drones have the capability of storing data and transmitting that data to hostile actors, and 2, the Chinese law requires both that these companies share their data and that these companies inform the government prior to informing the public of any security vulnerabilities in the software or hardware. As a result, the Chinese government agents have the ability to hack into these systems and retrieve data without the knowledge of their U.S. Users. So this bill, short bill overall. I'm going to just summarize Section 2, which is like the meat of the bill. It requires the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency to work with the Department of Administrative Services to compile and maintain a list of cleared drones. The cleared drones would be those that are determined to be safe and secure against the threat of being hacked or leaking data to unauthorized parties. They will likely include those cleared by the Department of Defense pursuant to the Blue UAS list available at www.diu.mil/the blue-UAS-cleared-list, and I can get that to y'all, but based on that. And then Section 1, in addition to defining the unmanned aircraft systems, this section, 1, encourages state and local agencies to buy cleared drones, and 2, after January 1, 2028, prohibits state and local agencies from acquiring a drone that is not on the cleared list by the Georgia Emergency Management and Homeland Security Agency. And we have, and what we line up with, as we're looking at it, is be compliant with the Federal Aviation Administration standards, have been cleared for use by the United States Department of Defense, and be compliant with requirements of the Federal National Defense Authorization Act. And so, I mean, pretty simple bill, but I mean, I think something with drones, while seeing that in the news, even the drones flying over some of our military bases and whatnot. And, I know myself, in the military, I've gone through a big drone school, and a lot of y'all know what I do in the military, we've even done a lot of war games with these drones. Drones are scary. And it's something, and I know there's some other bills floating out there that handle other aspects of drones and all that, and making sure we have the balance of making sure national security, protecting our communities, and with the feds have already taken the lead on this, we need to catch up, because, it's not just the military bases. When you look at the big picture, and we do it, and what I do in the military is, it's not just military bases, it's the infrastructure, it's the grids, it's everything. So that's why the state, our cities, we need to be in line. If we're using drones, that could be a national security risk, because all that gets compiled together when our foreign adversaries down the road want to do something. It's a huge part of it. It's not the military bases infrastructure, it's our cities, our county, and our state. So that's what I'm carrying, and I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have on this bill.
All right. Thank you. We have Representative McCollum.
Thank you for bringing this bill. I just had a quick question. I had one of my cities had reached out to me, one of the officers, and I guess they have a drone, and they were concerned about, apparently they have one of these drones that you're speaking of, and they were concerned about cost. I know there's probably some grants in there, and then he was saying, I don't know anything about these drones, but he was saying that he felt that the Chinese drones were better than American-made ones are, the ones that are built or anything like that. Do you have any insight on any of that at all?
Well, I can say, yeah, they do a great job building the drones they do, but I believe with this new administration and the focus on national security and the threats abroad, which are massive, I believe we're about to see some huge investments happening here in the United States to build up our drones. We need to, because the next war, specifically, drones are going to be all over the place. It's kind of terrifying. But, it's definitely cheaper from China. But I'll say this also, is we put it 2028 to fall in compliant with the bill, if we pass it. But there is no price tag on national security on our country. There's no price tag on lives, possibly being lost, So I think it brings all that together. This is a national security risk. Great question, but I do believe, and we have a lot of companies here in the United States that are starting to spring up, and they're building drones, and they'll quickly catch them up, and I believe shortly, hopefully they can compete with the same prices, but lives matter.
So it's pretty much if you build it, they'll come. So that's a good point, and I think it's a great bill, and I appreciate you bringing it. I'd be remiss with not asking, because they asked me to ask the question.
Great question.
Thank you.
All right. Representative Ridley.
Thank you for bringing this, and I just, I'm not a supporter of the communists either. I grew up, with my friends yelling better dead than red. So, but my question is, if this is a national security risk, why hasn't the federal government done anything?
They have. They passed the. Trying to find.
I'll help out a little bit here. In fact, Representative, we're trying to kind of make sure that we are paying attention to what's going on in D.C. So back a few years ago, the National Defense Authorization Act, I think it was 2023 or 24, actually honed in on these and stopped some of the purchase at the federal level. Right now, this is one of the reasons that I'm really interested in getting some policy on the Georgia level, is that right now the United States Commerce Department is considering completely banning a lot of these Chinese drones. And so the feds are doing it. I think that as we all know, the feds do what they want to do, but what we're also trying to do is make sure that we are aware of these issues at the state level, and we're being proactive in our policy. And this allows all of our experts at Homeland Security, our law enforcement folks, our experts on drones to all get together and come up with a list that we know will have drones that don't leak information to the Chinese government.
Thank you.
And I'll say, I mean, drone technology and is every day advancing quickly. So, I mean, we need not just be the federal level, it needs to be the state. We need to be collaborating, paying attention to the advancement of technology with these drones. And, yeah, thank you.
Also, just for the record, sir, if you would, since you did jump on the mic, will you state who you are?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm Tom Rawlings. I serve as policy director for a group called State Shield. We're a nonprofit. We have no dog in anybody's fight in terms of these issues, but what we do is we are trying to draw attention to the Chinese threat, or really the foreign adversary threat at the state level. So we're working on these issues in a number of different states.
Okay, all right, thank you. Chairman Hitchens.
And on Tom's behalf, I know Tom, and he, besides that, he used to be a commissioner in the state government for years and is a great guy, very knowledgeable. But number two, about the drones, you know, I was an intelligence officer in the military for a while, way before China became a problem. So we thought. But, you know, I got notified about 20 years ago that the Office of Personnel Management in Washington had been hacked. And everybody that had a top secret clearance, the Chinese had all their information from every time, you know, they redo your clearance every 5 years. So they got all my information. I had to give up my bank accounts information, and they provided me with coverage for 5 years myself. But in China, the companies are required to provide the state with information. And the reason I think these things are so cheap, number one, is the cost of labor. But number two is what value they get from sending them over here in the intelligence sector. So, and I appreciate the bill. I think in the last couple of years, we have not been proactive at the national level about a lot of security issues. So.
All right. Thank you. Anybody else got any further questions? At this time, we would entertain a motion if somebody would like to make one. Oh, sorry. Got ahead of myself. We have just one person to speak on this one, right? Noah Rentz, did you sign up to speak on this one? I was expecting you on 295, sorry. He can go, you can do it from the podium there if you want to.
Chairman, thank you.
All right.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Noah Rainitz. I'm an associate for the Georgia Municipal Association representing Georgia's 537 cities. I will be very brief in my testimony because I hate to do this, but we are ultimately neutral on the legislation. But we are implicated. I'd like to draw your attention to line 48 of the legislation, and that reads, to the extent practicable, a state agency, county, or municipality or other political subdivision of the state shall purchase or acquire only the approved unmanned aircraft systems, provided on that after January 1st of 2028, no state agency, county, municipality, other subdivision can procure a drone from off of that list. So we have a number of municipal police forces that employ drones as a kind of a man force scaler, right? This helps them with rapid response scenarios, search and rescue scenarios, hostage scenarios. They're fantastic tools. With that being said, it was mentioned earlier by Representative McCollum, a large number of these drones are manufactured by foreign adversaries. So working to have a maintained list of approved procured drones managed by the state, moving in that direction by 2028. We think that is something that cities would be able to participate in. So for that reason, we are neutral, and we think that you've kind of worked to scale that implementation factor over time. So that concludes my testimony. I'll pause if there are any questions, but thank you, sir.
Okay. Representative Neal?
Yes, thank you to the chair. To the speaker. So I think, I know we tried to discuss this earlier. Would it be appropriate, in your professional opinion, that we provide some type of incentives for Georgians or just in general to increase the manufacturers? Because we've kind of spoke about the fact that we don't have many manufacturers in this country. Would it be appropriate to provide some type of incentive at some point if we're mandating this to local entities?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that you wanted to ask in my professional capacity. Representing the Georgia Municipal Association, the types of businesses that we cater here in the state of Georgia, that's a little bit outside the scope. Now, if I were to take off this name badge and speak here as a citizen, I would say bringing those high-tech industries to the state of Georgia, cutting-edge technologies, bringing those jobs here stateside into the state of Georgia is something that's fantastic and we should champion in this body. So I would agree with that.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Any
you,
other
Chairman.
questions? No? All right, thank you, Noah. All right, that seems to be all the speakers. Double check, make sure I don't mess this up again. Nobody else to speak on this House Bill 205, correct? All right. What's the will of the committee? All right, we have a motion to pass. We have a second. Any discussion? All right, all in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. All right, very good. It carries. Thank you. Next, we're going to have House Bill 246. I'm looking to see if the sponsor is here. You see him? Aha. The timing could not have been better. House Bill 246, Vice Chairman Houston Gaines. You walked in the door at the perfect time.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
House Bill 246,
Yes, sir. Floor is yours.
and y'all have LC 4539. Great.
We do.
This bill should be fairly familiar to the committee, as I think this bill, near similar language, passed out of this committee last session and maybe even multiple sessions before that. And we do have the Georgia Sheriff's Association here in the room, Terry Norris and Mike Mitchell, who can maybe speak to some of that history. But last year, Representative Ken Vance carried this legislation. It's, I guess, to make it simple, it's Sheriff's Qualifications Bill, or as you may know it. And, the House has considered this multiple times. The Senate's considered it multiple times. It just hasn't quite gotten over the finish line. But the intent of this bill is to ensure that at the time of qualifying, that a sheriff meets the requirements that they will ultimately have to meet within 6 months of serving as sheriff. And what we're really trying to do here is ensure that, again, right now, the code says that within 6 months of becoming sheriff, they have to get the required training. What we're trying to do is ensure that they get that training at the time of qualifying so that someone doesn't get into office 6 months after they're not able to meet the training and are removed from office. And I'll tell you about an example that's actually ongoing right now in Macon County that really has brought this issue to a forefront. It's an individual who's running for sheriff, and again, there may be folks in the audience who can speak even more to this, but it was an individual who posted actually revoked his certification, and so it's basically been a long legal battle. The election board has taken him off the ballot, then they were put him back on the ballot. It's been a mess in court, and so now they're to the point where he won the election, but he's been removed from office, and so now the other individual who he beat is serving as sheriff. They're going to have a special election in March. But in order to avoid those kind of legal questions and challenges, again, what this bill does is it requires those who are going to qualify for sheriff at the time of qualification to go ahead and get the training. And one of my questions, and one of the things that I wanted to ensure, is that we're not prohibiting anybody from running for sheriff. And you can go get the training pre-service. And that was one of the things that I thought was really important to ensure that, that we're not stopping somebody from running for sheriff. Again, an individual who's not currently a peace officer could go and get that training. And as y'all know, we've increased that training up to 800 hours now. But that, in my opinion, is the critical piece to this, is that even if you're not currently a peace officer, you can go get that training prior to qualifying. You can still run and serve as sheriff. And, Mr. Chairman, that's the crux of the bill, and I'm happy to answer questions. I'm sure there's folks who want to speak to it, but that's kind of the crux of the bill.
All right. Thank you. We do have a question. Is that Representative Neal? I'll go you first.
Thank you. Thank you to the chair. Thank you to the author. And sorry ahead of time, Terry. This question is a new question. So when you say have the training ahead of time. So say that the post increase the hours to what, plus 600, plus 800 hours to be certified. Are you contemplating that these candidates need to know that far in advance that they're going to go for the seat? Because, originally, the way it was originally written is because depending on the hours of how hefty that was, to give you 6 months to go through that process, especially with the new standards that are about to come about and almost double that process. Are you anticipating that these people need to know that far in advance they're going to go for sheriff? Because, a lot of these positions, including hours, people make the decision on the last day before they run. So I'm just trying to understand what your thought process was behind that.
Terry, do you want to? I think I understand the question, but I'm not 100. You're saying if the number of hours were increased on the requirement, would someone who was contemplating running for sheriff in the next number of years know that that number of hours increased? Is that?
Well, just making sure, because it's a long duration. I'm trying to think through the pre-planning that a person needs to have.
Well, that's a good, and I think, and again, if Terry has any comments on this further, but that was something I was really asking about too, because how often is training available for someone if they're wanting to go pre-service? And as I understand it, like in Columbia County, for example, there's multiple, just this year, obviously, throughout the state, there are multiple opportunities throughout the year. So, as I understand it, Terry, please correct me if I'm wrong, but someone could contemplate in January, get their training by March qualifying, and still run. I mean, that would be a tight time frame, but it is possible. But again, you think about it, let's say they didn't go this route, they qualify, they get elected. At that time, they still only have 6 months to do it once they're elected anyway.
Well, I thought we were removing that, if I can clarify. Are we
Yeah, I was going to let,
That's right,
I was
we're
gonna let
remo-
Terry speak to it
but we
real
are
quick, if you
removing
don't
that.
mind.
Because it wouldn't even be an issue if we passed this bill.
Okay.
All right. Terry, you want to step up to the podium and just see if you
So
can answer
for
that
clarity,
for me?
not to diminish the importance of the question, but I would think any responsible candidate would know the requirements of the qualifications and take the necessary action to get that training, would be my answer, short answer.
Okay. All right, thank you. Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If my memory isn't completely warped, is this effort's been happening for a few years,
It has,
correct?
that's
So
right.
what's been the holdup?
I think a lot of it, and Terry can correct me if this is wrong, but it's more of just not getting over the finish line. It gets to the House, gets to the Senate, just never has quite gotten over the final hump.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I think when the last year or year before it had a floor vote in the Senate, only 4 people voted against it. I believe, is that right?
Is he the only one?
But last year it didn't get a floor vote in the House. It's just been back and forth.
Okay. Let's see. Chairman Hitchens.
Mr. Norris, don't run away.
I didn't know I was still called upon.
Isn't it true now that you can go to school at one of the VOTEC schools and it's completely free? You can get that training.
You can get that through Hope, I think, helps that. And
That's right.
not all the VOTEC, but several of them do offer that, yes, sir.
Right. Thank you.
All right.
That
Thank you,
training is
Chairman.
also offered through the Georgia Public Safety Training Center and through the Regional Training Academy located at the Columbia County Sheriff's Office.
But there's a cost associated with those.
Well, there would be a cost on pre-service for anyone.
Right.
The cost at the Columbia facility is, just for the training, is $1,500.
Right.
All right. Representative Neal, you had a follow-up?
Yes, just want to clarify. I do support the bill.
Okay,
Just want to
thank
say
you.
that. All right.
Very
Thank you.
good.
Thank you.
And Representative McCollum, you waive? I'll waive. Okay. All right. Terry, you're the only one I think signed up to speak on this. You want to go ahead while you're there and just?
Well, thank you, and thank you all for looking at this bill again this year. It has been brought before this committee, and y'all have always been very kind to us and passed it out of this committee, so thank you for that. But there are a number of reasons that this bill is important, not to mention the least of which is we all want the best law enforcement officer training we can get for everybody. And the one thing about this is in today's times, you must pass a physical agility test in order to even be admitted into the training. If you're not admitted into the training, or if you do not pass the training, you cannot get certified, and consequently, you cannot hold office. So this is a practical matter as much as anything else in these times. This bill was written, this law was written many years ago when that was not the case. But we certainly appreciate your consideration. I'll be glad to answer any questions, and I hope you'll support us on this bill.
All right, thank you very much. Representative Jackson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Terry, so this would be a qualification to run for sheriff then, if we vote on this and put it into law?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
All right. Anybody else have any other questions?
I'd like to make a motion to do pass.
All right. We have a motion and a couple of seconds. Any further discussion from members of the committee? All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. All right, that carries.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, Vice Chairman Gaines, we will move on now to House Bill 288.
Great, and if it's okay, I'm going to have Matt Reeves join me. He helped with this bill, and I've hired him as my lawyer to represent me in this case.
He did tell me on the way over here when I saw him earlier he would be providing air support for you.
Thank you.
So
It's a complicated lawyer bill, so it'd be great to have him. So
well,
thank
then
you.
we need a complicated lawyer to help figure it out.
That's right. That's right.
All right, you have the floor.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And I know there are several folks who are going to want to speak on this bill and can speak even more in depth than I can. But essentially what this bill is working to do is to try to ensure that our law enforcement officers, if their credibility has been questioned by a prosecutor, that they have the ability to defend themselves and take it to a court of law and ensure that they have the opportunity for due process. That's the simple measure of what this bill does. Several states have worked to address this issue, and it's all based on Supreme Court rulings. Some folks call it a Giglio list, some people call it a Brady list. But what this really is all about is where a prosecutor, through formally or informally, puts a law enforcement officer on a so-called Giglio or Brady list, and then all of a sudden that officer, their cases may never be, they won't be called up on as a witness, or their cases may not be prosecuted, and it makes it really challenging for those officers to get employment at that time or in the future. And so what this does, again, is gives officers the opportunity to defend themselves if they are put in that position. And I've kind of broken this down is what the bill does in three different parts, and I'll try to go through those succinctly. And the PBA is here as well, and I asked how many cases. I was just going to pull up. They've handled 39 of these cases association-wide, including 6 cases in Georgia since 2021. So this, while it's not a ton of cases, it is impacting our law enforcement officers, and we want to retain and recruit the best officers into our state. And I think this is an important thing for our officers to know, that we have their back and that they have the opportunity, again, if they are accused of something, that they have the chance to go to court and prove their case. And so, again, what this bill does, and how I break it down, is in 3 different ways. So the first way is if they are called in a court case, and under current statute and under the rules for state bar rules, if a prosecutor believes there's an issue with the credibility of an officer, they have to provide the defense counsel with that information. What this bill changes in that case is that they now would go to the judge first. The judge would determine if that is the case or if not the case. If the judge says, yes, the credibility of the officer is in question, then they would give it to the defense, and they would also now give it to Post to investigate. If the judge says no, then they would not do so. We'll get back into that. I think you're going to hear from a lot of folks who want to discuss that particular point because the professional rules for the state bar do indicate and do say that you have to provide that information. Again, we'll hear a little bit more about that, I suspect, when we're working on some language to address that concern that you'll hear from the prosecutors. The second of the 3 prongs is if there is an employment issue, if we're just going to take adverse action on an officer, whether it's suspending or removing an officer, there's now a process in place. There would be a post-hearing, and this would now be taken to post. So that's the second of the three prongs. And the third prong is where if a prosecutor just says, I'm never going to call this officer to court in a court case, whether it's an official list or unofficial list, now that officer would receive notice, because one of the things is officers some of these cases don't even know that they're put on the so-called Brady or Giglio list. And then now this is the opportunity where an officer will be able to take it to Superior Court and be heard in front of a judge and address those concerns and again get due process. So that's simplifying what is a complicated bill. There are multiple examples. I mean, I won't read you the entire letter, but this is from the Wayne County Sheriff's Office. This is a many-page long letter from the sheriff there, and I actually had a chance to visit with the sheriff yesterday and talk through his concerns in that county. But this, is something that is occurring, and so I think that this bill does a good job of addressing that. Again, we are working through the one question that some of the prosecutors have, and you may hear some of that. I don't know if Representative Reeves wants to add anything, but again, what this is all about is giving officers due process, because what's happening right now is some officers are getting blackballed, for lack of a better term, without any due process, and ruins their career. I actually got an email, I think the spouse emailed the entire general house, and I don't know if you had a chance to read that email, but hearing her story and her husband's story, they have fought and fought and fought to clear his name, and they were found innocent in any criminal case, but and really shown to have done nothing wrong, but they can't clear his name. He's not able to get he was not able to get reemployed. And I'm sure y'all read that email. I actually called his wife yesterday and had a long conversation with her, and she told me just how important it is that we address this issue, because it is hurting our law enforcement officers. And I think you'll hear that from the Police Benevolent Association, the FOP, who are here as well and have worked really strongly with us to try to craft a bill that addresses the issue.
All right. Thank you very much. Questions from the committee. Representative Panich.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. So I practice in this space. I'm familiar with Giglio. I'm familiar with Brady. I have some questions to help me understand what this is. Over the last 5 years, you've had 6 in Georgia, right? Or 4 years, you've had 6 in Georgia.
They've gone through the Georgia Police Benevolent Association. That doesn't mean that's the only number of cases, but with that one organization.
Okay, and what happened? I mean, what formed the 6? They had a Giglio letter written against them, and they went to a hearing, or what?
And if it's okay, I think Patrick is here with the PBA. It may be better for him to speak directly to that, since there are specific examples. Patrick?
Well, I can get back to that. That's not my main question.
I may be
Sure.
able to shed some light on that. What this statute, or what this bill does, is it provides a certain and definite due process for these issues, whereas right now it's kind of informal and all over the map. This is an important issue with Brady Giglio. They've been on the books for a long time. This gives a statute where the officer has due process. You have notice, you have declaratory judgment in Superior Court, you have post-certified proceedings in Title 35. So you have multiple very specific, certain and definite ways to clear your name if you think that you should not be have an impairment letter in your file.
Okay, so you're giving due process to somebody who's not a party, he's not a defendant, he's a witness, right?
Material witness enough to be on the Giglio impeachment. Here's exculpatory evidence. This is a bad officer who has, untruthfulness and is somebody who, is going to get ripped up on cross-examination. So that's what the prosecutor is saying by having an impairment letter like that in their file. So that's going to have an adverse effect on that officer's employment and the current job with promotion as well as future jobs. So it's a very adverse event for a law enforcement officer. This gives notice to the officer they've been put on the list, and it gives some recourse for them to say, there are 2 sides to that story. I want to clear my name.
Wouldn't that happen at trial when this information comes up? What, by the defense to cross-examine the veracity of the witness based on whatever background was given by the prosecutor?
Well, the idea of these impairment letters is the prosecution is basically handing this officer up to the defense saying this is a bad officer. they're not trustworthy enough to back up these charges. And so that's going to have a very adverse effect on that officer's future. So this gives the officer notice if they've been put on that list, so that the officer can say, I disagree, I want to have my due process and be able to show why that is an inaccurate allegation against me. This gives a process in Georgia, like many, many other states have done since the 1970s when Giglio came about after Brady. Georgia's behind in this important area, and we have a recruitment and retention issue with law enforcement, and this is something they know about. It's important to them. That's why they've asked for this bill.
Just add one comment, because I think this may go to your point as well, is sometimes, and many times, like when I was talking to the sheriff yesterday, cases that officer was involved with were simply just dropped by the prosecution. So they never went to trial because, there was a question of the officer's credibility. And so that officer's, every single case he's been involved with got dismissed. And so it never goes to trial to even have the questions you're asking to be brought up.
Right. So you're now going to tell a prosecutor that they can't use their discretion on how to make a case or whether to go forward on a case until there's a hearing in front of a judge where the defendant is not allowed to be present or have notice of? Because once a lawyer finds out that there's this issue, unless in trial the judge says, I'm not going to allow it, the judge is going to allow it. It's cross-examination, which is supposed to be thorough and sifting. I mean, we cross-examine witnesses all the time about their veracity. And so restricting that ability of the defendant, I'm of course concerned about false allegations about an officer, but I've had officers that have done terrible things who have lied, that I need to cross-examine at trial for the benefit of the defendant. So I'm trying to understand. I mean, I don't have a problem giving the officer notice that this is coming.
That's what this statute does.
Or that they have some administrative issue regarding his or her employment after the fact. My concern is what happens in the trial where a defendant, we want to have all the information about every witness who is going to be testifying, especially the more material ones. So that's my concern. I don't know if PAC was involved in drafting this.
Well, we're
or
going to
what
hear
the
from
position
them.
is. Okay,
So
thank
we got some more people who want to ask some questions.
I
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Representative Cummings.
My questions come from more of a space in corrections, because that's my background. And working with the federal agency, we had to turn over a similar list. But this was after an administrative investigation was done, and this was after some wrongdoing was found on the part of that officer. So the investigation had already been completed. Unfortunately, some of these officers had a lot of investigations that were, found or not found. And then we were required to turn over that information to the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I'm just a little bit confused here. Are you saying that the first time the police officer hears about the wrongdoing is when the prosecutor decides to put him on the list? Nothing administrative has been done? There hasn't been no internal investigation? Or what's... That just seems kind of strange to me, that a police officer would get to court and this is the first time he's hearing about an allegation that happened 2 years ago or something.
Representative Cummings, you bring up a great point. The federal government's probably got a 150-page bill or statute. This is a very brief bill to implement something in Georgia that is a version of what you have in due process with the federal government. That administrative procedure you talked about, that is in this bill. Right now in Georgia, it's very informal, and we have a patchwork in the 50 circuits. This gives a statewide standard, and it also gives the ability to have both sides and have a proceeding before you start damaging law enforcement's employment file with an impairment letter.
So if an allegation is made right now, there is no internal investigation?
So, I mean, I think you're spot on with your comments, that right now the prosecutor can single-handedly, without an investigation, put an officer in this position and there is no investigation. That's what this is trying to address, is provide a mechanism for an officer to have an investigation, to be heard in front of a court of law, versus just a single prosecutor saying they don't believe the credibility of an officer without any sort of investigation.
And does this impact only police officers on the street, or are you talking about all law enforcement, including correctional officers?
Post-certified.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Representative Neal?
Yes, thank you to the chair. So for me, I worked internal affairs in a law enforcement agency, and I've also sat on conduct review boards to determine how we punish officers from termination to simple warnings. So I guess some of my question aligns with Representative Cummings. From like, so if you're in trouble with me, you get served with Garrity. And so can you explain like how Garrity relates to this and the notification and like and that the gap that happens between there and court?
This bill defines a Brady Giglio impairment letter, and it makes sure that the officer is going to receive that letter when one is created, and it gives the officer due process in responding to that letter. It gives a certain indefinite process. This is an issue that deals with both the prosecution and the officer, and this gives a process for the officer to respond if they disagree with being put on that list.
So can you give me like an example? Like say, give me an example of where you skipped internal affairs, you've skipped this side, you've skipped the conduct review board, you've skipped us firing you, and it gets there. Like, can you give me an example of what that looks like?
Brady deals with exculpatory evidence. Giglio deals with exculpatory evidence concerning the truthfulness or veracity of the officer. So if the officer had a false report, if they had put something false in a police report in the past, and in this case, they are being put on, the Brady Giglio list as someone who's filed a false report, the officer would be able to say, okay, I've been notified about that false report. I have another side, second side of that story, and there's a proceeding for the officer to get to tell their story in front of a neutral body and have an outcome of that, and then they can appeal that. It gives certainty and neutrality on the officer being put on a Brady Giglio list rather than somebody putting them on there with one side of the story. It has the whole facts and cross-examined, credible, trustworthy due process.
So, for instance, say you had an officer, they didn't have a complaint at the law enforcement agency, they didn't have any of those issues, but there's a case, it's a regular criminal case or what have you, that there's found to be a problem that happened during the course of that case that was not an internal affairs issue. So is that the direction we're kind of going?
Well, it could be internal affairs or not.
Okay.
But I would say the veracity and the truthfulness of the law enforcement officer, that is at the heart of Brady Giglio.
Okay.
So that's very important. I mean, if an officer has a prosecutor put a Brady Giglio letter in their file, an impairment letter, that's going to scar that officer for the rest of their career. Mm-hmm. This is a way for the officer to get to tell their side of the story and make sure that should have been in the file and that truly was exculpatory evidence about untruthfulness that would be subject to a criminal proceeding, and that officer is not the one you need to have out there as your witness at trial. It gives the officer a chance to explain the officer's side of that situation.
Gotcha. Okay.
Just like the federal government apparently does in corrections and other proceedings.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions from the committee before we move on to some of our speakers? All right. See, first we have Pete Skandalakis with PAC.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to address this committee. I am sympathetic to the plight of the officers that we're talking about. In my career as an assistant DA and then 25 years as a DA, I'll bet there were less than 4 times that I had to supply a Giglio letter, not only to the officer, but also to the agency employing that officer concerning the truthfulness of that officer. So I'm sympathetic to the police officers. I've spent my entire career working with police officers and admire them greatly, and sheriff's deputies. But I don't think this is the vehicle to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish. And I say that this way. We must remember that Giglio and Brady are cases decided by the United States Supreme Court and also by the Georgia Supreme Court, which protect the rights of the defendants. They're not intended to protect the rights of police officers. I'm not saying police officers don't have rights, but I'm saying administratively it needs to be handled a different way than judicially. So Giglio and Brady are about the credibility and the credibility of police officers, of law enforcement officers, the veracity of law enforcement officers, and whether or not that information ought to be disclosed to a defense attorney. Even if a judge were to tell me as a prosecutor, you are not to tell the defense attorney that this officer has credibility issues, I am under an ethical obligation under the professional rules of conduct to disclose that to the defense counsel. So I'm being forced in a position by this statute. If a judge says, don't tell them, Pete, don't tell them that this officer has credibility issues, do I want to subject myself to contempt of court, or do I want to lose my bar license? And I will tell you this, I'm not the brightest bulb in the circuit. It was hard for me to get my bar license. I'm not going to lose my bar license. I am going to disclose any information that I think is exculpatory, that I think is Brady material to defense counsel every time, because I think our system of justice depends upon a fair jury trial. I understand the situation here. I understand the problem. But when you're talking about the professional code of conduct and what we're obligated as prosecutors to do, this statute impedes upon that. Even if you don't send a Giglio letter, let's just say that you've gone through this procedure and the judge says no Giglio letter. Judge still can't tell me who to call as a witness. And let's say that I don't disclose the fact that this officer has received a Giglio letter, and the defense finds out there's been a hearing. Well, that's an appealable issue that'll go up on the Court of Appeals in the Supreme Court, and I promise you, any ex parte hearing that you've had will be overturned. That case will be overturned in a heartbeat. And I'm not saying that this isn't an issue that we need to address. We don't need to address it through the criminal justice system through a court hearing. Because, as Representative Panic said, the police officer is not a party to this case. The party to this case is the state of Georgia, was as an obligation to put up truthful testimony, and then the defendant, who has a right to exculpatory evidence. And Mr. Chairman, if it's okay with you, Mr. Tyler Mann from the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office is here. He was in traffic. He didn't sign up. I'd like to cede some of my time to him, if that's okay with you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about traffic when it's raining in Atlanta, but we'll give him the benefit of the doubt. If you'd like to step on up, we'd love to hear from you.
By the way, Tyler Mann was a Giglio officer with the U.S. Attorney's Office, so he has some understanding of the precedent and the procedures.
Okay.
Thank you, Pete. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Tyler Mann. I'm the Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs in the DeKalb County DA's office. As Pete noted, prior to returning to the office in this policy role, I spent 7 years as a line AUSA in the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Northern District of Georgia in the narcotics and dangerous drugs and violent crime and national security sections. The last 2 years of that service, I was a Giglio officer in the office, which made me partially responsible with a handful of other AUSAs for reviewing and managing the office's Giglio policy and reviewing disclosures that went to defense counsel. My office sees this bill as extremely problematic for a number of reasons. The first is that it is much broader than I think has been described today with respect to the sponsors. Let me give a little bit of background on Giglio. Giglio is a standalone constitutional obligation of a prosecutor's office to disclose information to a defendant that he might use as impeachment or bias information at trial. It goes directly to a defendant's right to a fair trial under the Constitution. A ruling by a court, as Pete indicated, preventing us from fulfilling that obligation is not just a violation of the rules of professional conduct, it's a violation of the defendant's constitutional rights and our ability to fulfill those rights. Let me go directly into the bill. As I said, it does more than addressing Giglio letters. Giglio is much broader than an office deciding to send a letter making an official declaration that a witness will not be called. It's a obligation to disclose evidence that might go to impeachment or bias. In other words, a prosecutor, a trial ADA, or the leadership in an office might say, we have reviewed personnel files, we see indication that there's information here that a defense attorney might want to address on the stand. We need to disclose that. We're not making a determination on credibility. We're not making any official letter filing. We're not doing anything official. We're not making a decision. We're simply disclosing to the defense attorney that this information exists. There are three things that can happen there. The first is that a prosecutor's office reviews a personnel file. And to say that these investigations or determinations are made by a prosecutor without any input from internal affairs, that's an extremely rare instance. I've never seen that happen. The U.S. Attorney's Office never did its own investigation of an agent. I've never seen a state prosecutor's office make its own determination. The first step, generally speaking, is a candid conversation with the officer, which includes a list of questions that gets to potential issues of credibility. Have you ever had a disciplinary filing related to your credibility? Have you ever filed anything on posted anything on social media that might implicate bias against this defendant or others? Have you ever testified in a civil proceeding and had your credibility attacked, et cetera, et cetera? That's a conversation between the prosecutor and the witness. That's step one. Step two is to receive information from the officer's employing agency, from an existing investigation, the existing files. Those files are then reviewed by the prosecutor, and a determination is made whether there is anything in the officer's past that might implicate credibility. There are all kinds of things that can be in a disciplinary file that have nothing to do with credibility. Allegations of repeated speeding on the job, for instance, or being late, or not showing up to a post, all kinds of things that might show up in a disciplinary file but have nothing to do with credibility. Those would never be turned over by the prosecutor because they are not Giglio information. That's category number one. Category number two are items that the prosecutor, in an abundance of caution, in order to follow Giglio and his progeny and honor the defendant's constitutional rights, would disclose to the defense and then fight to keep out of evidence at trial. In that instance, the prosecutor would turn the information over to the defense attorney and then go to the court and say, Your Honor, we've disclosed this information, but it is not appropriate fodder for cross-examination, and it should be kept out of trial. That is often successful. There are often disclosures to defense counsel that never make it into trial. And I should have started by echoing what Pete said, which is that prosecutors take this extremely seriously. Police are our allies. They are absolutely necessary to any case we ever make in any court in any jurisdiction. And we take this burden extremely carefully. We are very conscious of the implication and the impact that a finding or an implication of anything other than perfect credibility might have on a law enforcement witness. We are constantly thinking of that. So I've covered two possible examples, and one kind of subset is that we can disclose items to the court and say, we don't think this is Giglio. We're providing it to you because we don't want anybody else to know about it. But because we care about the constitutional obligations we have, we want you, Judge, to look at this information that we know of from the employment file of the officer and make a determination before we disclose it to the defense about whether it's Giglio. That happens a lot. Finally, in very rare circumstances, we find information in an employment file that we think not only is Giglio, but is appropriate fodder for cross-examination. In that instance, we disclose it to the defense. We say we believe this is likely Giglio. Again, we never make at least in my office and in the U.S. Attorney's Office, we never say to the defense, you should be skeptical of this officer's credibility. We never make that determination. We simply disclose, pursuant to our constitutional obligation, the information that we have discovered. Then we go to the court and say, this is Giglio information. We would like to severely limit the questioning that's allowed at trial. And that's a whole kind of sub-litigation within some trials. This happened. We concede that the defendant has a right to cross-examine the witness on it, but we don't need a sideshow circus on this officer. So here are the questions that we think should be allowed at trial. And the defendant and the government get the opportunity to stand before the court and litigate over what those questions should be. The expansion of the obligation here, this is not just about an office's decision to send a Giglio letter, which, as Pete noted, none of this would prevent me from saying, okay, I've determined that there might be an issue here. I'm not going to call this officer. What it does is put us in a very awkward position. If an officer had a right to go to the court and the court said, you are not allowed to disclose this to defense, we would then have a decision to make. We would have a couple choices. First of all, I don't think this bill gives the government the right to appeal that decision. So then we're either forced to go to trial without turning something over that we think we have a constitutional obligation to turn over, which, as Pete noted, is a golden appellate opportunity for the defendant. The defendant is going to know there was a hearing on this. He is going to know that the government was concerned about some piece of information, and he is going to know it wasn't turned over. As soon as that trial is concluded, if the government gets a conviction, any decent defense attorney is immediately going to file an appellate motion based on that lack of disclosure. That's a huge problem. The second option is to dismiss the case, and none of us want that. But to get back to the breadth of this, I'd like to point you first to Section 4. This is a revision of the General Discovery Statute. This is not about a Giglio letter. Subsection B of the new 1716 says any disclosure of information by a prosecuting attorney which relates to the credibility of a witness who is a peace officer shall be submitted to the trial court for approval prior to disclosure. That means in every single case. Now, in the U.S. Attorney's Office, I had, 20 investigations going at a time. And they were very long term, and I had months, sometimes years of notice before I had to step into a courtroom and try that case. In most state offices, ADAs have dozens, sometimes as many as 100 cases. And the trial calendars that come out for these ADAs have 20 cases on them. And you don't know until you walk in the courtroom on the day of trial which one's going to trial sometimes. It's a much different practice. It's very hectic. It's on a very short time scale. Every ADA is reviewing his cases for these potential issues, and when constitutionally required, turning the information over to the defense. This says that any single time I, as a trial ADA, want to inform defense counsel of some potential issue, again, not making a conclusion, just saying, hey, we got this report, it's from his employment file about this time 3 years ago when he lied to a superior officer about XYZ. Anytime we want to turn that over, the officer is entitled to a hearing in front of the court with counsel, with subpoena power, and with the right to demand a transcript at the expense of the prosecutor's office. Beyond the constitutional concerns, that is a giant logistical and financial burden on prosecutors' offices. The hearing itself is problematic. As came out in response to Representative Panich's questions, the officer is not a party to a case. It's the state versus the defendant. I don't even know how this hearing would work, in that it's the officer seeking redress, so it's either a new action by the officer against the state, or it's part of the action and the defendant is not allowed to be present. The whole point of this is to prevent the defense from finding out this information, which means the trial judge is having a hearing that directly implicates the defendant's right to a fair trial, and the defendant isn't present. I am not an expert on this area of constitutional law, but I know that I have never been in a hearing that was related to any criminal action against any criminal defendant in which the defendant was not offered an opportunity to be present. The fact that in this case the defendant can't be present while the court is deciding whether this potential impeachment evidence is offered to the defense strikes me as a huge constitutional problem. Going back to the obligation to inform the officer before sending a Giglio letter, the requirements in the bill are that it has to go 20 days before trial, which again is extremely problematic for very busy assistant district attorneys. It has to include the finding by the prosecutor's office, and again, there's not always a finding. Sometimes it's just, you know what, defense, in our adversarial system, you should take a look at this, and you should handle how you want to address this. any recommendation the prosecutor made, a list of witnesses relevant to the issue, a list of evidence relevant to the issue, the name and information of the prosecuting attorney, and the date on which the determination was made. This is another gigantic logistical burden for our offices. We read Section 2 as giving an officer the right to file suit against a prosecutor's office that makes this determination. In other words, we think we're fulfilling our constitutional obligation. In fact, are fulfilling our constitutional obligation with respect to a defendant, and the officer has the right to then file suit in court against the state of Georgia, against the prosecutor's office. Finally, I don't think that the bill addresses all of the concerns that have been cited today. Our inability to disclose Giglio information would not make us more likely to call the officer at trial. In fact, there are many situations that, as I said, the majority even, in which offices make a Giglio disclosure and are either able to keep that information out of trial through a motion in limine, or are able to limit questioning such that calling the witness is not fatal to the case. Under this bill, the only prudent thing, in my opinion, for a prosecutor to do is to avoid calling the witness altogether, thereby avoiding any appellate risk associated with putting him on the stand, despite having failed to disclose what he identified as Giglio evidence. How in the world could a prosecutor feel good, ethically or strategically, presenting a trial witness who has a credibility issue, a potential credibility issue, that prosecutor was prevented from disclosing to the defense? He simply couldn't. The only option would be to say, okay, I cannot have that witness on the record at my trial because of the appellate risk. That's a gigantic risk that I don't think many prosecutors would be willing to take. Finally, there's the possibility noted in the bill that...
Mr. Mann?
Yes.
You've said finally a couple of times
I'm so
now.
sorry.
So
I'm sorry.
And I appreciate all the information. I really do. We've got a lot of folks, a couple more folks who want to speak on this, and our board's lit up over here with some questions. So if we can try to get to those real quick, that might wrap up some of the other stuff. So Representative Cummings, I think you were first.
Thank you. I don't know if we ever crossed paths, but I just want to make clear that turning over this information and it being presented in court as evidence are two entirely different things.
Entirely different things.
And it's been my experience that prosecutors truly go to the mat to protect officers, especially depending on the situation of the information. Like I had a situation where an officer was involved in a domestic incident with his wife, and the warden had to take action against that officer, which included firing. And the officer appealed. The warden didn't do it, but of course he's trying to protect the agency from a lawsuit if something happens down the road, you know. And so, and that officer was able to get his job back, and they were able to, when he eventually had to go testify, based on everything that had happened, the court kept it out.
Right.
Like it never came, you know, it didn't come back up. And that prosecutor fought really hard with that warden's support to keep it out, even though administratively he had to do something else. And I think that happens a lot in these circumstances, regardless of if you're a correctional officer or an officer on the street. So I think a lot of those protections are, you know, are there.
That's right. That's right.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a quick comment that may get us to go ahead and wrap this piece up?
Yeah, and I had a couple other folks I did want to hear from. There's some folks in here too.
Just real quick, there are some folks who I think traveled far and wide to be here, so maybe they could speak. But I'm more than willing to work with these folks. I think Representative Reeves is. Hear their concerns. They came to us about 2 hours ago. They've had the bill for a couple weeks, but we're happy to talk to them. So, you know, I would just ask for it to be hearing only so we can address that concern that they've brought up. But, you know, we can go through some of those. I mean, everything from the state bar concern about taking prosecutor's license. State bar is not taking any prosecutor's license because they haven't been, there's many DAs that they should have been taking their license. And there are some DAs.
I think that was another bill.
It is, yeah.
With, so.
And I also heard that all the DAs see police as friends, but I can tell you there's some DAs, including mine, that just got defeated, does not see police as friends. So there's many issues here. I think we've got to address it. We've got to give law enforcement the opportunity to have their due process heard, but I'm happy to work with PAC on that issue so we can move forward with the next bill as well.
All right, thank you. All right, next we had Chairman Saines. He waived. McCullum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have one quick question. Bear with me. I'm just no firefighter, so this lawyer stuff gets me confused. But so you said you were a U.S. attorney, correct?
Assistant, yes, sir.
Okay. I'm just curious. The feds always have these different rules for states, and can a federal agent, can they dispute a giglio the same way as the state can? And how does that work in the federal agencies? Does that make sense?
Yes, so it's not really a matter of disputing, although the way that it works in the U.S. Attorney's Office, first of all, our office would have no objection. I don't speak for PAC, but our office would have no objection to a requirement that whenever a disclosure is made, the officer be informed of that. I don't see a problem with that at all. I think generally, many offices do that as a courtesy and out of respect. But as far as disputing a giglio finding, because it's not really an official finding, the law enforcement, federal or state, could not say or would not say, you can't turn this over, because it's a separate constitutional obligation. It's not a statutory obligation. It's a constitutional obligation. So I've never seen a situation where the law enforcement says, hey, don't turn this over to defense. It's a legal and ethical conclusion. And then the fight is...
So are you saying that the federal agencies do have a way to dispute this differently than the state agencies?
No, I'm not saying that.
So you're saying that it would be fine with you if it's a federal agent that would be able to get a letter saying that it's okay? I mean, they would know ahead of time, correct?
So as a courtesy, generally speaking, if the U.S. Attorney's Office, for instance, decides that they're not going to call someone as a witness, that is communicated to the agency. But in a typical...
To the FBI or Homeland Security?
To whichever agency, exactly.
So in the state, and like I said, bear with me, so in the state, is that a courtesy as well?
Yes. It's not. I don't know that it's a requirement, and I don't know that our office would not have an objection to making it a requirement. But in a case-to-case basis, when a prosecutor decides to turn a piece of evidence over, that's not something that gets reviewed, and it shouldn't be, because it's not an post issue or an employment issue, and that's another thing that I think.
So isn't this bill doing what you're saying you're okay with doing?
It might do one small. What I'm saying might be one small part of the bill, but it goes way beyond that.
Well, I mean,
okay. All right. Hey, I got
Go
somebody
ahead.
else
Sorry,
real
Mr.
quick.
Chairman.
It's fine. Chairman Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I'm going to have to head to appropriations, but I do want to have a quick question. So, sir, how many officers in DeKalb County have had Brady Giglio letters placed in their files, out of curiosity? Do you know that?
I don't know that, and I don't know that every office handles it that way by putting a letter in a file. I think generally an ADA who knows of an issue might discuss with often it's a strategic trial question. Do we have a problem putting this person on the stand? An official declaration that this person should never be called is exceedingly rare, very, very, very rare. But in an individual case, an ADA might say, look, here's this thing that I think we probably should turn over. This witness isn't crucial. Should we call him or not? But that's not a letter that goes in a file or an official determination.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you very
much. Appreciate
your
your time.
Appreciate it.
All right. Next, we got a couple more folks that want to speak real quick. Next, we're going to have Mr. Jim Wright from the PBA.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And before you get started, I would just like to say personally, thank you for never putting me on one of these lists when I was working for the Henry County Police Department, and you were with the Henry County District Attorney's Office. It's been too long since I've seen you, but glad to have you here.
Thank you, sir. Good to be here. And good to see one of my old colleagues, Pete Scandalakis, here today. The issue here is one where the officers that are being placed on these Giglio lists, and it is not the issues of where you're debating on whether or not to call that witness, and that witness is, as for instance, the last witness testified to, is this witness, you're not going to prevent that witness from testifying. You're going to allow that witness to testify. The issues that we're having is when a DA decides, for some reason, usually in most instances, and it was my experience as well, when I had to make some of these rare decisions in cases involving witnesses in Giglio. It's with these instances where a DA decides for some other perhaps reason that he or she is going to put this witness or this officer on a what we call it a death penalty letter, because once that officer receives the letter, that they not only will that witness not be called in this case, but that witness will never be called, officer will never be called in any other case, period. That is what we commonly refer to it as a death penalty case. That officer is no longer allowed to work. His or her career is at that point ruined. So it is our position that if a death penalty letter is going to be issued to a police officer and it is not directly related, and obviously there are going to be cases where everybody knows why the police officer is no longer going to be called as a witness. He just got arrested, or there was a case, an investigation, and it was found that this officer indeed violated some policies and perhaps laws during that investigation. But it's in circumstances where, for instance, a case is presented to a grand jury and the officer, the case is no bill. And then that officer is put on the Giglio list. That DA decides, well, by gosh, grand jury no billed it. Well, I'm just going to put that officer on the Giglio list. We'll never, use that officer again. And that officer has absolutely no way to respond to that. As a former district attorney and assistant DA, I had a few instances where I had defendants file bar complaints on me. I had the ability to defend myself in responding to that bar complaint. When the Judicial Qualification Council starts investigating a judge has the ability ultimately to present and confront the evidence that is developed during that investigation. But for some reason, we don't allow police officers to have that same ability to try to at least address and to be heard. Notice, due process, notice in a hearing. To be heard. And for the DAs to sit down, interview the officer, find out exactly what is going on, what the circumstances are, and then make a determination. If after all of that is completed and the DA decides, yes, you're Giglio, I'll never call you as a witness, well, at least the officer at that point knows exactly why. I mean, I've had a chance to respond, I answered questions, and I've had my opportunity. So I think the process that we are dealing with, this is the start of the process to try to come up with a solution to answer a lot of these concerns. Judicially may not be the most appropriate way to handle this. I know in North Carolina, we have a DA's office up there that has decided to create a committee, a 3-person committee. And then they present their evidence. The officer comes in and has their hearing. And the DA, based on what the recommendation of that committee is, makes that determination. It takes the judicial process out and allows for that administratively. So there are DAs who are trying to accomplish this, and that is the goal, to try to give the officer the ability, if the death penalty letter goes out, to have the ability to have that issue addressed and to be heard as far as what the reasoning was and why. So with that, I'll leave with any questions, or I'll sit down and be quiet.
Thank you, sir. I think we do got a couple of questions. I believe Representative Panitch, you were first.
Thank you.
Yes. Mhm.
Good afternoon. What it sounds like you're doing is making an officer a super witness, someone who is able to escape any type of cross-examination on anything that the prosecutor thinks is worthy of the defense knowing, but the defense can't know. don't we treat officers the same as every witness? Aren't they subjected in an adversary system to the same type of cross-examination on their veracity like anybody else? Like you would the defendant if the defendant took the stand?
Absolutely. But what we are trying to address is the issue when the decision is made for that officer to never be called as a witness. It is at that decision-making point.
Right, but then you're telling the prosecutor, you have to call this witness because they don't have the Giglio letter? I mean, I'm not sure how this fixes that. I mean, doesn't a prosecutor have a right not to call the witness that they don't want to call?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I agree with that, yes. I mean, it's done all the time. But this is a situation where a DA has made a determination that that particular person will never be called as a witness in any case. And so the officer at that point, well, why? What are you relying on to make that decision? You know, I at least I think I have a right to know, because you're now trying to ruin my career. I think, you know, you at least have the right to know what you're basing that decision on to issue that letter banning me from testifying in any case at any time.
I understand that from an administrative point.
Right.
But the problem is when you change the course of a trial because you're telling the prosecutor they can't use evidence they believe is Brady or Giglio. Are you okay with this bill if we take out the criminal part?
I think what needs to be looked at is the process. What direction is this bill going? You know, we need to reconsider. Is it going to be the judicial side, or is there going to be some kind of administrative side that we can all agree with, and a procedure that can be used statewide so that everybody will be on the same page, get the same notice, and get the same opportunity. Again, if it has to come out of judicial, okay, as long as there is a process that is in place that the officer can utilize when that letter goes out, once that notice is received. And I think we're all, a lot of us were ex-police officers, so we can understand, the feeling you have when you get that letter and your career is ruined and you don't really know why. You don't understand what the basis was for that, make that decision.
And again, I think the officer should have noted.
Yeah,
Oh, sorry.
yeah. Well, that's okay. Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I heard you correctly, you said that someone could be put on a Giglio disclosure because of a no bill. Can you explain that to me?
So sometimes what happens, say for instance, excuse me, you present the case to a grand jury. The grand jury has heard the evidence and has decided that they are going to no bill that case. That doesn't prevent the DA at some point from reviewing that circumstance and making a determination that yes, I'm going. There's a credibility issue there. I feel, as the DA, and so I'm not going to call that witness, that officer, as a witness in any case whatsoever. The DA is not obligated just because the grand jury no-billed it to base his decision on that no-bill alone. The DA can still make the decision based on the evidence that he or she knows exists in that particular case and still put out a Giglio letter on the officer, regardless of what the grand jury did in that case.
Right, but I think if I'm hearing you is in the example that you're using is the prosecutor would have in fact concerns about that witness's credibility, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. But it may be a grand jury, it may not be necessarily based on the credibility. It may have been an issue in the case that was involved. I'm trying to think of an example right off the top of my head. In both instances, I guess if the grand jury, it all be based on what the evidence was in the grand jury that was presented to the grand jury.
Right, but if it's just insufficient evidence to surmount probable cause, that's different from a credibility, truthfulness issue,
correct.
right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Good point. That was what I was trying.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank
no
you.
more questions. Maisie Lynn Girton, Georgia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers.
Good afternoon, Chairman. We'll be very brief because I think my colleagues from PAC and the DeKalb County District Attorney's Office might have sounded like they were on my staff roster today.
Somewhat.
We couldn't have
somewhat.
been more aligned in what they brought to you today. And I think the thread that I would just raise up for your consideration that's come through all that you've heard today is that an administrative process makes sense here. It's what makes sense in the state bar process. It's what makes sense in the judicial consideration process. Those are all administrative processes. Injecting this kind of process into a criminal prosecution is not only unnecessary, but as you've heard, potentially extremely unconstitutional. And you don't have to look very far to see recently in Fulton County, there was an ex parte hearing that you might have heard about in a case that was often referred to as the YSL prosecution. And though that case ended up pleading out, it didn't go to a conviction that could be appealed. It was very problematic to the entire case that ex parte hearing happened. And the way the bill is structured right now, using this judicial process is setting up a potentially ex parte communication that's unnecessary, given the fact that you could use administrative processes to address, we believe, all of the concerns that have been raised today.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Mike Mitchell, Sheriff's Association.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll be brief as well. My name is Mike Mitchell. I'm the Deputy Director at the Georgia Sheriff's Association. We fully support what we're trying to achieve here, whether it's administratively or legislatively, judicially. We hope that we could see something work through the process and work out on behalf of the officers. This is certainly an area that needs attention, the due process. So however it works, we hope it works out for the positive.
All right, thank you very much. And lastly, was there somebody from the FOP that wanted to speak real quick?
Good afternoon.
You
Thank
got a big book there. I hope you're not going to read all that.
No, sir, I'm not. I assure you I will keep it brief.
Thanks.
My name is Ken Davis. I'm with the LaRusso Law Firm. I'm also Associate General Counsel for the Georgia FOP. Our firm, the majority of what we do is we get involved with officers when they have issues of various kinds, including some of these issues. And I think some of the things that have been said earlier, the first thing I would like to say, thank you for your service. You mentioned you had internal affairs background. I retired from a law enforcement agency. I wasn't always a lawyer. I spent 29 years in law enforcement before I made this decision. And I ran an internal affairs unit. And you mentioned Garrity. And Justice Douglas in Garrity v. New Jersey had a very profound quote. He said that police officers are not like anybody else. They are not unlike anybody else. They don't get just a watered-down version of their rights. They get the same version of their rights as anybody else does. And this is truly a due process issue in a number of ways. Now, when I look at this bill, and I've heard the questions and I've heard the arguments, I had a phone call with Mr. Scandalakis earlier, whom I deeply respect. And I understand some of the issues, and I'd kind of like to parse it into two parts. There is the criminal aspect of it. When you've got a particular case, sir.
Just two small parts, please.
Yes, two small parts. I'm sorry. In those cases, I understand the ex parte issue. And as an attorney, I have to respond to that as well. And I think some revision where the defense becomes part of that process could solve that issue, right? Where you have both parties that participate in that and both parties can have a right to appeal to it. I agree with that. I don't disagree with that. The issue that we're trying to solve, however, is this issue of these random, and I say random, there's usually something behind them, but these random Giglio letters or Brady letters where an officer's career is ruined for no reason, and to put a specific to it, and obviously for client confidentiality, I'm not going to discuss the names or where, but I had a client a couple of years ago. His first indication that this was an issue was when he got called in by his employer to tell him that they were firing him. And the local prosecutor had sent a letter to the employer saying that this issue had arisen and there was a complaint. The GBI investigated it. The prosecutor's office says the GBI has not given me enough information or sufficient cause to move forward with the criminal case, but I just don't feel comfortable with this officer anymore. I'm kind of paraphrasing the letter just a little bit. And I'm not going to call them for any cases, and I'm dismissing all of their cases. And that's wrong, and that shouldn't happen. That does a disservice to the officer. This young man lost his job. We get these calls pretty regularly, and at the moment we have no tools in our toolbox to help them when this happens. And because that happened, he loses his job without knowing why and without any real good particular recourse and no due process. So what we're trying to accomplish here through this bill, and yes, some revision may be needed. There may be some revision to address due process. Again, I don't argue that. But the officer needs due process too. It shouldn't be a circumstance where an officer, just because there's some accusation or some allegation or some political reason or what have you, that a prosecutor just blanket says, I'm not ever going to use this officer, and sends that back to the agency, and this man loses his career over it. And that shouldn't happen. This man or woman loses their career. And to speak to the no bill issue, we had a case. Exactly that happened. Two officer defendants. One was indicted, one was not, and it was in Atlanta. Fulton County prosecutor said, we're never using this officer for testimony again. Fortunately, the chief of police in Atlanta saw fit to find other things for this man to do. But my point being, this is a problem, and this is a problem that needs resolution. And whether it's through this bill or some revision of this bill that addresses those issues, it should happen. But we do not need to leave our law enforcement professionals out on a limb to be able to lose their career at the whim of a prosecutor. Open myself for any questions.
Thank you, sir. I don't see any lights flashing, so you did a fantastic job.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are going to, I believe, Vice Chairman Gaines had mentioned earlier that he's going to speak with Mr. Scandalakis, and
Yep.
We're going to keep this as a
together.
hearing only for now and let y'all get together. I wanted to try to hear as much as we could of this because everybody traveled here today to do this, and so I do think it is it's an issue that needs to be addressed in some shape, form, or fashion to make sure that an officer that's had their credibility questioned has a means of defending themselves in that, and so. If y'all will work together on that, that would be great. And thank y'all all for coming to all your presentations, and look forward to seeing you soon. And then we're going to skip on to House Bill 295 now. So, thank you, Matt. You're not going to stay for this one? Or, sorry, Representative Reeves, you're not going to stay for this one? So,
I haven't hired him for this case yet.
gotcha.
We may need to.
Yeah. All right, and just so everybody knows, as everybody else is kind of moving out from this one, there are a lot of people that have signed up to speak on this one. We have no more than 30 minutes for this because this room is booked for another committee at 3 o'clock. And so we are going to hear from everybody we can possibly hear from on this. We are going to set some time limits though, and I think many of the folks that have signed up may be simply saying the same thing, kind of all echoing the same thing. So if we can keep that in mind and be very judicious with our time, that would be fantastic. So, Vice Chairman Gaines, if you want to go ahead and start.
Sure. Well, I'll keep this presentation brief. Similar to the first bill, I presented this as a measure that we largely considered last year that passed out of committee. It was governmental affairs last year, but did pass out of committee. It was towards the end of session, so we weren't able to get it over the finish line. But this is a really simple concept to just ensure that local governments actually enforce the law. And the way to do that is to hit them in their pocketbook and make sure that if they are not enforcing the law, it provides the citizens for an opportunity to be either reimbursed for security costs that they've had to incur because their local government is not enforcing the law, or to get a reimbursement for the loss of diminished value of their property because, again, the local government is not enforcing the law. Our hope with this bill is that it's never used. Our hope is that local governments simply do their job and enforce the laws of our state and their local governments, and then no one would ever be able to utilize this. And we've already actually seen that start to take place in Arizona. Arizona passed a very similar bill. In fact, it had bipartisan support, a constitutional amendment that passed this November, very similar measure. And already many local governments, I pulled some articles, City of Tempe, Mesa City Council, Goodyear, 3 cities just right there that have already passed local measures to actually enforce their laws as a result of the constitutional amendment that passed on the November ballot that, again, had bipartisan support. I think got almost 60% in Arizona, which is a swing state and a close state. And so that's really what this bill does, and how it, the mechanism is how it plays out in the specific policies that are impacted by this measure is, one, if a local government determines and decides not to enforce the law that we passed last year, House Bill 1105, that ensures that we do not have sanctuary policies on immigration, or if a local government fails to enforce laws and ordinances related to homelessness, in particular illegal public camping, loitering, obstruction, panhandling, possession of controlled substances, shoplifting, or public intoxication while trespassing on private property. So those are the measures that are incorporated into this. There's a process that already exists in code that we reference in the substitute. Do y'all have, I guess I should have made sure the LC 473370S? That is right, okay. So there's on line 58, it actually has the direct reference to code section 485-380 that has a process that already exists in law where local governments work through a refund process if a citizen overpaid or has another reason to request a property tax dispute. And so that way we're not creating some new process in law. That's how this would play out. Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer questions. I know that, to your point, there are a lot of people who are here to speak on it, and so maybe we could run through those and then take questions afterwards, however you want to do it.
Okay. Well, I have a question from Representative Neal, so we'll go ahead and try to knock that one out.
All right.
Representative Neal?
Yes. Thank you to the chair. Thank you to the author. So my first question would be, like, on line 33, I've been contacted by locals in reference to questioning the local government adopts and enforces a policy, pattern, or practice of. The question came up about the elements of proof when it comes to proving the pattern or practice. The concern was the bill being silent on what the proof or the elements of proof of pattern or practice would be. Can you outline what that would look like?
Sure. So that an example of a practice, for example, and this is something I heard from a large retailer, for example, is that they would repeatedly call 911 for shoplifting cases over and over and over and over again, and law enforcement would not respond because they had been directed to do so. One of the challenges that we're trying to address by not just including the word policy is oftentimes is they're not written policies. A lot of times it's the local government saying, in word and in practice to ignore certain laws, but it's not something that's actually written in policy, and that's something we are trying to capture. And it's something we talked a lot about last year, and that's how we left the language in this bill. And I should have mentioned there are a couple of just other headlines here from locally, for example. This was a couple years ago, but APD will no longer respond to shoplifting calls in parts of Atlanta. Not finding the homeless population in certain parts of the state, another headline where they're just not enforcing the ordinances and laws of the state or local governments. But again, one of the issues is pattern and practice is trying to address where there's not a written policy to ignore that law.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Okay. All right. I don't see any more lights. So we're going to start with our sign-up list here, and it looks like we have GMA and ACCG signed up together. So that's,
how about that?
That's great.
I'm sure they're
we do take y'all both at the same time. So,
and I will mention, Mr. Chairman, GMA did send some edits late yesterday, and appreciate those edits. I do have copies of a potential amendment. I don't really have any issues with what GMA has offered as an amendment. So I do have copies of those.
Okay, yeah, I think we've all got copies of them as well. That's it's 470133.
You got it.
Okay.
And I'm again comfortable with all those amendments.
All right, thank you.
Chairman, sorry, 470133. 470133.
Does that look like the amendments that you had worked with him on?
Correct, yes.
Okay, all right, very good.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Noah Rainitz, again with GMA. I'm joined by Larry. Larry, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Sure, Larry Ramsey with ACCG.
As I begin here, I would like to, again, thank Vice Chairman Gaines. He did reach out to us a week ago today, let us know he was bringing this bill. We were likely going to have some issues. We've communicated some changes in the legislation. I see these are here, and I'm happy to see those potentially offered as a committee substitute. Generally, I'd just like to talk through some of the concerns with the legislation, and I'll do my best to be brief given the time. This legislation does one thing very, very well, and that is how it dictates the legal process of claims and compensations for affected property owners. Our association has no objection to these processes as defined in the legislation, and we believe the appropriate cross-references do exist. You had mentioned the 48 cross-reference again for the overpayment of taxes. In the case the bill becomes law, this process could be effectuated by a local government. Our concerns lie not with that measure, but they lie with not with the remedy, but with the cause for allowing it as a preceding factor. Line 33 of the legislation details the local government's adoption and enforcement of a policy, pattern, and practice that would then lead to a maintained public nuisance. I think when we think about identifications of those three things, the identification of a policy would be easy. It's black and white. If a local government has an ordinance instructing them to detain individuals accused of shoplifting, of loitering, of solicitation, and then there is a written policy somewhere else, either on the website, via email, through text message that says, we're not enforcing that ordinance, that makes sense. That's a black and white, open and shut case. But where we have concern is with patterns and practices. While policies, an example of this could be the bill in line 111. The bill clearly defines how prosecutorial discretion is protected by this legislation. If a DA's office, or rather a judge, simply declines to try or has a habit of dismissing minor offenses such as shoplifting, loitering, or public camping, that decision has been made independent of the city government. The city government could show up, as it was mentioned earlier, to arrest somebody for shoplifting that had been accused of that crime, take them, go through the process of arresting them, detaining them, and booking them, with the knowledge that the DA is not likely to try that case. They're going to dismiss that. The judge may also dismiss that if it comes before his court. That's just not something that they're interested in doing. DAs are maybe looking at more violent crimes, higher level crimes. If a local law enforcement is aware of that, is aware that that is the opinion of the DA's office or even the judge, should we really be asking them to go through those public safety methods of arresting them, detaining them, and turning them in for the accusations of committing those crimes? And if they decide to not do that, if they stop doing that, I think that in itself ineffectuates a practice. They have a practice now of not arresting for those types of crimes, when in reality we were not the ones making the decision. That was that the DA or the judge was making that decision. I think situations like that arise the gray areas within this bill for practices and patterns, and in our opinion they open up cities to mass liability where the sovereign status of the city has been waived, and the city itself has to prove an intangible pattern or practice did not exist. They have the sole ability to defend themselves in court. So those are some of the concerns. I'm happy to stand for questions. I guess we'll let Larry speak on behalf of ACCG as well.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, and I will not repeat any of the points that Noah made, but just add to those a couple of other potential points on this. From ACCG's perspective, we're concerned, as we usually are, with costs and administrative burdens that any legislation might impose. The author, and again, we thank Representative Gaines for talking with folks on our staff about this bill. He mentioned about hitting local governments in the pocketbook. This General Assembly has passed bills in the last couple of years that already do that. House Bill 1105 enhanced added penalties on the sanctuary policy side. So it is already the case that local governments with sanctuary policies are subject to withholding of state funds. That's obviously a big stick for local governments. Senate Bill 92 last year allowed the Attorney General to take civil action against local governments that are not enforcing rules against public camping and sidewalk obstruction, et cetera. So there are a lot of penalties and recent penalties on the books that speak to these issues and really haven't had time to percolate, I would expect, to see whether those are efficient ways to deal with the issues this bill seeks to address. But beyond that, and the points that Noah made, one thing I wanted to add had to do with this, the structure of this mechanism for claims against the local government. One point is that there is a cap tied to property taxes paid in the previous 2 years. It is not clear whether those are property taxes paid to the offending local government. It appears to say it would be for all property taxes paid, and as you know, most of your property taxes go to the school system. So in this case, it appears that the county or city would be in effect refunding property taxes paid to a different government under this bill. But the other structural issue I would point out to the committee, and something that ACCG would oppose, has to do with the incentives that this bill puts in place. So a claimant, a property owner, has no risk by filing this claim. The bill as it's written, and again, I'm sorry, I haven't seen the sub, and so I don't know whether this has changed at all, but there is no risk to the property owner to file a claim. The bill says that they cannot be held liable for any costs or fees that the government incurs, even if the claim is completely frivolous. On the flip side, it's very clear that the claimant's attorney's fees will be paid by the local government if the claimant is successful. This is similar, and I've been around a long time, and I'm a former county attorney. It reminds me of the situation we had when the tax appeal statutes were changed about 20 plus years ago to have the same type of incentives in place, where the property owner's attorneys would get their fees paid. And as you know, in a tax assessment appeal case, if the assessment gets dropped, it might save the property owner a couple $100, residential property owner a couple $100 in taxes, but the attorney's fees could go into the tens of thousands of dollars. And we're setting up a system here, as I read the bill, that would do something similar. There is no skin in the game for the claimant to bring this, but there's potential substantial liability, particularly on the attorney's fee side, to the government. Because again, on the outside, we're hitting them in the pocketbook. Where does who puts the money in the pocketbook? It's the taxpayers, right? So if the local government is paying out on these claims and paying attorney's fees, ultimately it's the taxpayers paying those expenses, and the winners, and I will say this as a lawyer, the winners are the lawyers, right, who bring these type of claims. From our perspective, we think there are incentives and penalties already in the existing law, as I already said, to address these issues to the extent they exist. And so in this context, in the bill as we've seen it, ACCG is currently opposed to it. We look forward to working with the author, the committee, as the committee sees fit, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, thank you. Well, we had one. Now we got three. McCollum.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for bringing this bill. I've got a question on your rationale. So what I'm hearing is if one part of the government is failing, the other part should just quit. So that'd be like saying if we pass a bill and we know that the whoever we're passing it toward is not going to do it, that means that we shouldn't just pass any bills. But my next point is do you ever watch Cops? I love that show, Cops. That's the best show. And on Cops, when they go out and say, for instance, you get called out for a shoplifting, right? Well, if the criminals know that, for one, you're not going to come, they just keep shoplifting, it gets worse. But the second thing on Cops is they'll go out for a shoplifting crime, and lo and behold, in the trunk of their car, there's a dead body. Every time. So if you go out and you quit policing because you're not going to be, the DA's not going to prosecute them, what about all those other crimes that potentially that person that was shoplifting is going to be done? I mean, yeah, it's probably planted, but I'm just saying, but to me, I think that if you do your job as a city, if you're going to have a police department, you should run the calls that you were called out for. Just like me as a fireman, I've run calls for headaches and everything else. Do we not want to run them? No, but that's our job. And I think that the cities should do their job. And if the DAs decide not to prosecute, that's not the public's fault. Thank you.
Okay, I was going to say, I don't know if there was a question in there or not, but that was very, very colorful commentary. And I would say, I've responded to several shoplifting calls and many different calls in my career, and I never found a body in the trunk when I showed up there. I found some in other places, but never in a trunk. Representative Panich.
Thank you. So many times I assume the DAs or not the DAs, the police are sending officers to the most, aggravated kind of crimes versus the lower level crimes if there are two happening at the same or multiple happening at the same time. So I can understand that if the resources from the police department and then the prosecutor's office is directed towards more violent crime than it is for property crime, because they have fewer resources, aren't you then just continuing that cycle by allowing the citizen, the homeowner, to sue for essentially the lack of the resources that the counties have, and then it's like this vicious cycle? I mean, is that a concern of the city or county?
I think absolutely. And one thing, maybe I didn't mention it earlier because I'm speaking before the Public Safety Committee. You all know this. Public safety resources are strained all across the state of Georgia. If we could all agree on one thing, it's that we should be investing more into the training of new police officers, into their accreditations, and into their equipment, right? So I think the example you offered was apt, right? If there's a call for a shoplifting, but there's also a call for a motor vehicle accident, with life-threatening injuries, one of those is going to take precedent over the other. And that's resource allocation, and those are decisions that are being made in real time. It's not that one of those doesn't matter, but it's that one of those requires those individuals to be on the scene immediately. And I do think there is kind of a negative feedback loop in here to where situations like that continue and continue and continue. Property owners, businesses feel as if their public safety needs are not being met, and then they're able to seek a remedy through this legislation that then causes the local government to further hemorrhage revenues, and it's just a negative feedback loop in a sense. So.
And if I could just add one further comment on that, and Representative, I think that was a piece that's not totally clear to us, at least in the bill that we had seen. And it goes back to the pattern and practice. What is a pattern or practice? There is an exception in the bill for exercise of prosecutorial discretion. So we've, on a case-by-case basis. What about the law enforcement officer on the street who's making the discretionary decisions about how to respond to particular cases? I mean, again, I think that's a drafting thing that could be potentially addressed as to who is it that's adopting the policy or procedure, but I think it's certainly a fair point. How do you deal with the situation where folks on the street, the law enforcement officers on the street with limited resources, are having to make the decisions about how they enforce any given law?
All right. Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm curious about the costs, recognizing that it's difficult to predict cost of litigation and attorney's fees, but can you give us any sort of guesstimates on that? Because my understanding with some cases is it may be reasonable of a range of like $300 to $400 per hour. Other cases it's $700-800 an hour. Like there can be wide variation just in what is viewed as reasonable and then what is total cost. So that came up as a discussion point, so I'd like to just have some more clarity if
Representative, I'm happy to try to speak from my experience. As you know, it's ultimately up to the judge to decide what the reasonable rate, reasonable number of hours on any case may be. Because this is a new process, it's hard to completely estimate what costs would be. I can simply tell you from my experience in the tax appeal context, those cases, sometimes they're resolved at the administrative level. They go on to Superior Court, and usually they don't go beyond Superior Court. In my experience in tax appeal context, which again is a somewhat similar structure to what I see being proposed here, the taxpayer was maybe, and again, residential would be different than a commercial type property owner as to what their tax savings would be. The savings to a successful residential taxpayer in that context would be in the few $100s context, and so that's a loss to the government, where the real cost was for the attorney's fees. And so in my experience, in a case that went through Superior Court, you're talking in the tens of thousands of dollars that the county and the Board of Tax Assessors would ultimately be paying to that attorney for the taxpayer, when the savings to the taxpayer is small, but 10 to 20,000 was probably a reasonable estimate, a case that gets into discovery, et cetera, at the Superior Court level. But how that translates across a jurisdiction, I don't have good information for you.
Understood. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you. That seems to be all the questions for you two. I did have just one thing I wanted to state real quick, one each to two of you. And Noah, you mentioned this, and you and I had this discussion a little bit earlier. You mentioned about the city or those responding, if they fail to respond and they know that the judge or prosecutor is not going to bring the case, right? How's that? And I just, I think that may be the case, but then it would be incumbent on the city, municipality, county, in this case, they provide funding for those offices many times. And so if it's costing them, then they need to maybe reflect that in their budget. The citizen shouldn't have to not be served because of what they think, because of what the prosecutorial decision is going to be. Secondly, you mentioned about the taxpayers being on the hook for the bill. And I just want to remind everyone that the property owners that own these properties are taxpayers as well. And they're paying taxes for services that they may not be getting. So I just wanted to highlight those 2 points. But thank y'all very much for presenting. All right, here's what we're going to do. We are going to try to get to as many of these as we can until Chairman Werkheiser shows up and throws us out, because he has a committee meeting in here at 3. There are several that are, and this was probably going to be also continued. I think there's a lot of discussion having this, and I think Chairman Gaines has said there's some amendments and some things here too that he's going to work with him on and possibly get that into a sub, so we don't have to go through an amendment, and possibly some things we had from today.
Happy to work with GMA and ACCG. There were, particularly on a couple points that I think we get addressed.
Thank you. And there are some people who came today, and I really want to try to hear from as many as we can. But there are 3 people here from In-Town Cares, and if y'all could select maybe one spokesperson for that group, that would be super helpful, because I know you probably all want to be heard, but just having one representative from your group would be great. And you have handouts that we did not get ahead of time. That would have been also helpful.
My apologies, Chairman. Thank you, Representatives. My name's Brad Schweers, Executive Director of In-Town Cares. I really wish you could hear from our case managers. We've got 5 folks here who work on the ground who can speak to the details of the human element of what this bill would, in fact, bring about. So, as an agency, we're experts in the homeless outreach and navigation space. We have 20 dedicated case managers who are out on the ground engaging with people mostly experiencing chronic homelessness. We're one of the largest and most effective teams in the city. Last year we housed 231 people who were experiencing unsheltered chronic homelessness, and that number's over 1,000 since the pandemic began. So I think I'm here to talk about how I think we all want to end homelessness in Georgia. I think we probably all agree on that. My problem with this bill is it doesn't address the causes of homelessness. It doesn't address the solutions to homelessness, and in fact, it lengthens. The effect would be to lengthen the time that many people are experiencing homelessness. So on the handy chart here, if you've got it here, this is a slight oversimplification, but there's people entering into homelessness. This is the top arrow here. There's the time people are homeless, and then the yellow arrow is people exiting homelessness. And so the causes of homelessness, these are well documented. It's the main one being lack of affordable housing. There have been numerous studies across the country that have talked about this as really the only factor that determines why homelessness varies from one municipality to another, and it's the cost of housing and the availability of that housing, and also things like eviction, rising rent, et cetera. So this doesn't address the causes of homelessness because homelessness is a housing problem here in Atlanta, Representative Gaines, in Athens, your hometown, and everywhere, homelessness is a housing problem. The causes of homelessness, the city of Atlanta has actually been excellent. We've been doing some of our best work to end homelessness, which is the yellow arrow here, but we've had 1,000 more people who have entered homelessness than exited the system, and we had record numbers of people exiting the system. So this bill doesn't address that. It actually increases the length of homelessness. When people are arrested, then our team, our case managers here, it interrupts the process. We do a 5-step process of getting folks off the streets, getting their documents, getting them to the housing that they deserve. All of this just interrupts that process and lengthens the process, and again, doesn't help people move into permanent housing, and in fact slows that process down. So it's interfering.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We want to try to get one or two more. I know there's some people on the other side of the issue too that I wanted to hear from today if we can. But to your point, it does not necessarily address the issue of homelessness, and that is a problem. And I think we all identify that is a problem, and there are some other mechanisms to do that. That's not the issue we're addressing here. It does need to be addressed throughout the legislation. There's a lot of different things. We've done a lot of work on mental health in the last several years to try to help address homelessness and different things. And so Ms. Apley and I talked earlier about affordable housing. We've done a lot with that, try to help with homelessness as well. But this is a separate issue that we're trying to address from that. But
Sure,
thank you for being here.
I understand.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Eli Oaks, we're going to hear from, I think this person's on the, has a different opinion on the other side of the issue, and that's going to be the last person we're going to be able to hear from today. Mr. Oaks, I don't want to put you under any kind of a time crunch, but obviously you are. So, because Chairman Werkheiser is right there, and he's going to tackle you if you don't hurry.
Very brief. So, thank you, Chairman. Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Eli Oaks. I'm a policy analyst for Cicero Action, where we develop and advocate for accountable and innovative state-level policies in challenging issue areas to restore liberty and American governance. Homelessness and businesses, I think we all know, homelessness and business interests are deeply interconnected. When municipalities fail to enforce state laws on homelessness, businesses bear the consequences. They face property damage, public safety concerns, and economic disruptions. Small businesses in particular often struggle with storefronts becoming hotspots for crime and disorder, creating an unsafe environment for employees and customers alike. For example, the District Attorney's Office of San Diego County once found that homeless individuals are 222 times more likely to commit vandalism and 514 times more likely to commit arson than those who are not homeless. By empowering property owners to claim compensation when local governments fail to prevent street crime, House Bill 295 provides municipalities with a strong incentive to be proactive in managing unsheltered homelessness, while ensuring that businesses can operate safely and protect their property. We as individuals can choose where we shop to avoid street crime and disorder, but small businesses cannot run from these issues. This bill is a necessary tool to enhance public safety and protect the livelihoods of Georgia residents. So thank you for allowing me to testify before you today. I don't know if we have time for questions or anything.
Thank you. I don't see any. We really don't, but thank you. That was very brief, very informative. And this, we're going to have this be a hearing only as well. We will be coming back. Representative Gaines, you are going to get with GMA and ACCG and work on this. Thank you, everyone, for your time and your interest. This meeting is adjourned.